The validity of the new Mass. There was a question in the last class, at the end of the last class. I'm not sure that it was on put on the video or not, but someone asked whether Pius V's quo primum made the new Mass invalid. The two are entirely different issues, the new Mass and the old Mass, and how quo primum only affects the old Mass. Doesn't affect the new Mass. Quo primum makes the Tridentine Mass the Mass for all time. It says that we can have it forever. It cannot be abrogated, done away with. That's what quo primum did. It made it that what we now call the Tridentine Mass could be used by everyone, except for those who had permission to use another rite. At the time when this was a result of the Council of Trent. Pius V didn't do this on his own. It was because of the Council of Trent he did it. It was asked to do it, and he did it. But there were other rites available at the time, many rites. Some of them were new, some of them were very old. And the Pope respected some of those rites that had been around for a long time. And so he said that any rite that had been around for more than 200 years and had permission to exist could continue, unless the superiors of that order in council as a group decided that they wanted to go with the Mass of Pius V. But so Pius V put together this Mass, using Mass that was already there, but getting rid of anything that was extraneous that had been added by innovators. And he put together this Mass. He said, this is the Mass that it will be used universally throughout the whole church, now and forever. This is what the document said. Furthermore, by these presents, this law, in virtue of our apostolic authority, notice he's calling upon his authority. He is using his infallibility. We grant and concede in perpetuity forever that for the chanting and reading of Mass in any church whatsoever, this missal is hereafter to be followed absolutely, without any scruple of conscience or fear of incurring any penalty, judgment, or censure, and may freely and lawfully be used. That line means that anybody has the right to say it. You cannot be stopped from saying this Mass. Nor are superiors, administrators, canons, chaplains, or other secular priests or religious of whatever title designated obliged to celebrate the Mass otherwise than we have enjoined upon them. We likewise declare and ordained that no one, whosoever is forced or coerced to alter the missal, and that the present document cannot be revoked or modified. It cannot be done away with or changed, this document, but remain always valid and retain its full authority. Notwithstanding the previous constitutions and decrees of the Holy See, as well as any general or special constitutions and edicts of provinces or councils, and notwithstanding the practice and custom of the aforesaid churches, established by long and immemorial prescription, except, however, if more than 200 years standing. So in other words, he makes that one exception. If another church community has a rite that they use for Mass that has been more than 200 years old, they can continue to use it. Here the Pope's not saying that another rite might not be allowed by some future Pope, For what one pope can do, so can another. But he can't, but what he is saying is that regardless of what might be done, or what has been done, this Mass will continue forever. In other words, this document is affecting only the Latin Tridentine Mass. You're not saying a new one couldn't be made, and of course that would be under special circumstances. But this one will always be in effect, regardless of what happens. No one can abrogate it. No one can do away with it. And so everyone out there saying that it's been done away with, it's a lie. Anyone saying you cannot say it, telling a priest you have to have permission to say this, that's a lie. That's going beyond his authority. This authority, quo primum, gives every priest the ability to say this Mass, and every person the ability to attend it. So the next question is one that we touched on last time. Was the Latin Tridentine Mass abrogated? And the answer is no. That's quo primum says that. No, it wasn't. The first rule is that the Missal of Paul VI cannot be said to be obligatory in any strictly juridical sense which would impose its use and exclusive use, and that the Roman Missal restored by the decree of the Council of Trent and prescribed by the order of Pius V. So in other words, the Missal of Paul VI can't, just because he put it out, doesn't do away with the previous Missal. And the second rule by the bull quo primum by Pius V has not been totally abrogated by the Constitution of Paul VI, Missale Romanum, of April 3rd, 1969. At most, Pope Paul's Constitution derogates only certain particular details of the Tridentine Missal, which we will not discuss in detail here. If you want to find them, there are plenty of other places where you can get them, including the book, Crisis of the Church. And the third rule, even if it is supposed that these derogations of Pope Paul were strictly obligatory, the fact remains that they leave intact the three privileges contained by the bull of Pius V. Even though he says everybody has the ability to say this new Mass, the privileges given by Pius V still are binding. And that is, those three privileges are, first, the right of every priest to avail himself of the perpetual privilege discussed in Section 5 above. That's a quote, the Section 5 being of the bull. Second, the right of every priest to use, in preference to the Missal of Paul VI, the Tridentine Missal, which ratified a custom developed over the previous 15 centuries. And thirdly, the freedom of religious to keep the Missal of their order, or to use that of Pius V in preference to the Pauline Missal. Note well, religious belonging to orders with their own Missal have a right to demand that their chaplain should use their Missal even if he doesn't wish to do so. As a consequence, the faithful, too, have a right to partake of the first two freedoms, though through their priests, on whom these freedoms have been directly conferred. They may therefore legitimately ask their priest or their bishop to ensure that Masses are regularly celebrated in the Tridentine Rite. We are so certain of this doctrine that we feel able to add this final recommendation. If, and God forbid, any superior whatsoever rank should presume to deny its priests, religious, or faithful the exercise of these rights, they may and should denounce to their competent authority by every legitimate means this infraction of the bull of Pius V, as an unlawful abuse of their authority. So that's the Bull of Pius V, quo primum. Again, it applied to the old Mass. But the question this week is, what about the new Mass? Is it valid? The validity of Mass depends on the validity of the consecration of the Mass, the transubstantiation of the bread into the body of Christ and the wine into his blood. So the new Mass is valid if, first, it is celebrated by a validly ordained priest. First stipulation. If it is celebrated, and this applies to any Mass, not just the new Mass, any Mass, even the Latin Tridentine Mass, would be invalid if it did not meet these criteria. So it has to be celebrated by a validly ordained priest. Second, who uses the required matter, that is wheaten bread and wine made from grapes. Not grape juice, not gluten-free bread, not apple wine, cherry wine. It has to be made from grapes, and it has to be wheaten bread. Third, while pronouncing the required words, the words of consecration. And lastly, having the required intention. And it's that last one that hangs everything up. The priest must desire to do what Christ and the Church are doing in the celebration of the Mass. He must be a conscious instrument in the service. Were he to deliberately oppose the Church's intention by refusing, for example, to celebrate a sacrifice, but only intending to commemorate a meal or a community gathering, for example, that took place at the Last Supper, it would make the Mass invalid because he has the wrong intention. The intention of the Mass is that he is offering a sacrifice. And if he does not believe he's offering a sacrifice, if he does not intend to offer a sacrifice, the Mass is invalid. By the very fact that the new rite can easily be understood in the Protestant sense, it can also easily be used by priests who would no longer have the required intention, especially if they come through modern seminaries where this side is the idea that is promoted, that the Mass is a community gathering, a replaying of the Last Supper, something to bring us spiritually closer to Christ on the cross, but it's not a sacrifice. Such eventually is not in the least likely, considering the total false image of the Church, the priesthood, and the Mass, which has been communicated to so many of these young priests in the new seminaries. Moreover, the use of the bread, besides unleavened bread or wine that is made from something other than grapes, the fruit of the vine, or the omission of the correct consecration words, would render the Mass invalid. Now, a lot of people consider the new Mass invalid because of the change in the words of the consecration for many to for all men, which, by the way, Benedict had changed back, but not all national churches accepted the change and made the change back. And many of them still say for all men instead of for many. But this bad translation is linked to the theory of the universal salvation, that all men are going to heaven. and no one is going to be damned. And thus in actuality, favors heresy. But does it make the new Mass invalid? It's not certain that it renders the consecration invalid. It's not certain. Again, what does the priest intend when he says those words? Does he intend that all men are going to heaven? Does he actually accept that heresy? In which case, yes, it would be invalid. But if the priest understood when he says for all men that not all men are going to heaven, that it doesn't mean that it's not against the faith, namely that salvation is offered to all, but not all will accept it. In that case, it would render the Mass could be valid. Doubtful, but valid. Especially if the priest understands the formula in the heretical sense, in which case it probably is invalid. So you have a lot of questionable things going on here with the new Mass. Not saying that the new Mass is invalid. Archbishop Lefebvre said too, the new Mass may be valid. May be valid. If all the criteria are met, yeah. Why do you want to risk it? So is it permissible to take part in the new Mass? Even if the new Mass is valid, it's still displeasing to God, inasmuch as it's an ecumenical and Protestantizing event. It's promoting a heresy. It represents a danger to your faith. Thus, it should be rejected. Whoever has understood the problem of the new Mass should no longer attend it, because he would be deliberately endangering his faith. And at the same time would be encouraging others to do likewise, because they look at him and they think, well, he accepts it. And he's accepting these reforms. He's promoting it by his presence. Even when the new Mass is devoutly and piously celebrated by a Catholic priest and has absolutely unquestionable faith and the right intention, you still should not attend. The celebrant is not the issue. It's the rite that he uses. The new rite has given so many Catholics a false idea of the Mass, one that's closer to the Protestant supper than to a true sacrifice. The new Mass is one of the main sources of the current crisis in the Church. It is thus imperative to distance ourselves from it. So what should you do if you can't get to a Tridentine Mass on Sunday? Then you're excused from the obligation of attending Mass, because the precept to hear Mass on Sunday only applies to attendance at a true Catholic Mass. That's not a true Catholic Mass. You don't need to attend it. You are excused from the obligation of going to Mass, but you're not excused from the obligation of keeping Sunday holy. You still have that obligation. You have to do something to sanctify it. You can read the Mass in your missal. You can say other prayers. You can make a spiritual communion. Take the time that you would spend in Mass reading the Bible, reading the Mass, the Old Mass, and spiritually putting yourself in front of God as on an altar somewhere in the world where it is being celebrated, and then make a spiritual communion. Is there anything wrong with having the Mass celebrated in the vernacular language? The Mass works ineffable mysteries that no man can understand. This mysterious character finds its expression in the use of a mysterious language that is not immediately intended to be understood. That's why all religions, in their mysteries, in their celebration, in their sacrifices, in the old, in the past, always used a special language. The Hebrews in the temple, they used Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic or Greek or Latin or whatever, but when the priest who performed the rites in the temple used Hebrew language. The Greeks used the Old Greek. The Eastern Rite churches used the Old Greek. And the use of that language that adds mystery to the Mass, it adds reverence to the Mass. And it is also for this reason that certain parts of the Mass are said in a very low voice. The vernacular language gives the superficial impression that we understand what's going on, and we don't, which in reality doesn't exist. People think they understand the Mass because it's celebrated in their mother tongue. In fact, they generally understand nothing of the essence of the holy sacrifice, or what's taking place on the altar. It's a mystery. Mysteries are things we have to accept on faith. We don't entirely understand them. The purpose of using Latin is not to put a barrier between the faithful and the holy mysteries, but to better appreciate it from a different perspective. For that in other words, to appreciate this, the Latin gives a different perspective in that it distances us from what is going on. We move away from it and we see it. We see the whole picture, not just this up close. In order to penetrate a little into the mystery of the Mass, the first condition is to humbly acknowledge that it involves a mystery, something that goes beyond us. There are three reasons that favor the using of Latin. First of all, its immutability, or at least its stability. It's a dead language. That means it's not spoken anymore. And because it's not spoken anymore, it doesn't change. Languages that are constantly being spoken are constantly changing. New words are being added to, and old words are taking on whole new meanings. But a dead language doesn't change because it's not in use. So what it meant yesterday still means the same today and will mean the same tomorrow. Secondly, it's almost 2,000 years, it had been in use for 2,000 years in the liturgy. And it's a comfort to pray in the same language that saints before us prayed. And thirdly, the fact that it symbolizes and fosters church unity. Before the council, you could go to Mass in any country in the world, regardless of what language they spoke. You could go to Mass and you could feel at home, because the Mass there was the same way. It was said, you could respond in the Mass, you knew all the responses, because it was said the same way in your hometown, in your parish church, regardless of where you were in the world. It fostered unity. this person next to you might be Chinese, but they're saying it Latin, and you're saying the Latin, and we both know what's going on.